On October 8, 1969, professional baseball player Curt Flood was traded from the St. Louis Cardinals to the Philadelphia Phillies. This trade caused Flood to challenge the MLB's reserve clause and Bobby Coon, the commissioner, and take a stand against his own form of slavery. He never agreed on the trade, challenging the MLB's reserve clause, thus starting a conflict not only in baseball but in other professional sports such as basketball and football, leading to one of the biggest compromises in sports history: free agency. Curtis Flood was born on January 18, 1938 in Houston, Texas. At a young age, Flood began to grow to love the sport of baseball. Through the years, he became an exceptional baseball player. Since one of his old coaches was a bird dog scout with the Cincinnati Redlegs, after high school, Flood signed a contract with the Reds. He was invited to spring training in Tampa Bay, Florida. While living in California for most of his life, he was shielded from the ugliness of racism. Flood's bubble burst when he was escorted out of the side door of Redlegs Training Camp Hotel and taken to Ma Felder's boarding house, where the black players were housed. Flood says, "Until it happens, you literally cannot believe it. After it happens, you need time to absorb it." Rules had been invoked and enforced. I was at Ma Felder's because white law, white custom, and white sensibilities required me to remain off stage until needed. I was a good athlete, but this incidental skill did not redeem me socially. Officially, and for the duration, I was a nigger. Flood then was assigned to High Point Thomasville of the Class B Carolina League. Here, he played well despite subjugation of his humanities social mores of the times. He could not stay with his white teammates, and he couldn't even eat in the same restaurants as them. He couldn't use the gas station bathroom where the bus would stop. Instead, they would stop on a long stretch of road where Flood could wet the back wheel. Fans of baseball expressed the displeasure of seeing African Americans on the diamond as well. They heckled these African American athletes. Flood recalls his first time being heckled by saying, "One of my first and most enduring memories is of a large, loud cracker who installed himself and his four little boys in a front row box and started yelling, 'Black bastard,' at me. I noticed that he eyed the boys narrowly, as if to make sure that they were learning the correct intonation." Flood not only was displeased with the inequality in the world towards African Americans, but he was displeased with the inequality in baseball. The inequality that he saw was with the MLB's reserve clause. During this time in Major League Baseball, all players' contracts contained a reserve clause that specified the player and the club were to negotiate for a new contract. If no agreement was made by March 1st of that given year, the club had the right to renew the contract for 1 year. The clause had been interpreted to mean that the contract could be renewed indefinitely, giving the club absolute rights to the player until he retired. Unless the club released the player from his contract, he could not negotiate with other clubs. The club had the right to give a player's contract to another club without permission. The player was bound to his new team's contract by the reserve clause. It was only at the team's whim that they could be traded, released, or sold. This was the only form of free agency in baseball at the time. Curt Flood had a long journey through the minor leagues, but he eventually made it to the MLB and played for the St. Louis Cardinals. Flood was a fan favorite. He was known as a prolific hitter and a defensive wizard. He helped lead the Cardinals to 3 World Series. Despite the familiarity with Flood on and off the field, the Cardinals began to sour on Flood. Curt demanded a raise months after slipping on a fly ball in Game 7 of the 1968 World Series. After this, it seemed that his days in St. Louis were numbered. Curt was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies on October 8, 1969. The Phillies were known for their racist fan base and their subpar play on the diamond. Flood never accepted the trade, challenging the MLB's reserve clause, which meant that upon an expiring contract, the player's rights were retained by the team. By not accepting this trade, the sports industry was changed forever. Days later, Flood teamed up with MLB Players Association President Marvin Miller. On Christmas Eve, Flood sent a letter to MLB Commissioner Bobby Coon and demanded to be a free agent. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Coon, after 12 years in the major leagues, I do not feel I am a piece of property to be bought and sold irrespective of my wishes. I believe that any system which produces that results violate my basic rights as a citizen and is inconsistent with the laws of the United States and of the several states. It is my desire to play baseball in 1970, and I am capable of playing. I have received a contract offer from the Philadelphia club, but I believe I have a right to consider offers from other clubs before making any decision. I, therefore, request that you make known to all Major League clubs my feelings in this matter and advise them of my availability for the 1970 season. Kuhn immediately denied the request, which caused Flood to sue baseball. Many players in the league were quietly behind Flood, and their union leader, Marvin Miller, was instrumental in getting the MLB Players Association to pay for the cost of the suit. The court case between Flood and Kuhn went all the way to the Supreme Court. Flood lost a 5-3 decision. The court ruled that baseball was immune to antitrust laws. Antitrust laws are statutes developed to protect consumers from rapacious business practices by making it illegal for businesses to compete in unfair ways. Because baseball was a game rather than a business, they were immune to these laws. The judges held that the business of holding public baseball games for profit between professional clubs was not within the scope of federal antitrust law. Curt Flood may have lost the case, but it gave other players motivation to challenge the reserve clause and make free agency a possibility. Flood stated, "What I really want out of this thing is to give every ball player a chance to be a human being and to take advantage of the fact that we live in a free and democratic society, and he should have some choice." Although Flood lost the case, it had laid the groundwork for players to settle the issues at the negotiating table. By doing this, Flood had got a lot of people's attention of what was going on in the MLB. 3 years after Flood had failed, pitchers Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally played the whole 1975 season without a contract. Their contracts had expired but were automatically renewed by their clubs. Marvin Miller had been waiting for such a test case. The Players' Union filed a grievance on behalf of McNally and Messersmith, contending that a player's contract could not be renewed in perpetuity, a custom first established in 1879. This decision substantively demolished the reserve rule. Stunned, the owners appealed, but without success. Negotiations followed, however, and the union agreed to a modification of the reserve rule. Players with 6 or more years of major league service could become free agents when their contracts expired and would be eligible to make their own deals. The ruling allowed eligible players who refused to sign their 1976 contracts to choose free agency in 1977. The MLB also introduced the Curt Flood rule, which allowed players to veto any trade once they had spent 10 years in the major leagues. This was too late for Flood himself. He had financial and drinking problems, and he exiled himself to the island of Majorca. Flood spiraled into alcoholism and never was the same. After making a stand, his career was ultimately over. Curt Flood helped many athletes in different professional sports take a stand like he did. Just a little bit after he sued the MLB, Oscar Robertson and 13 other NBA players took a stand to challenge the reserve clause. Just 6 years after, the NBA introduced free agency. After the fact, free agency has been a sun coming up over the mountains and warming the whole valley, as Robertson put it. Since Flood, free agency has been introduced in all sports, such as the NFL and the NHL. Because of Flood, players took a stand and made free agency possible. Today, many professional athletes have no idea who Curt Flood was and why he mattered. Well, why does Curt Flood matter? Curt Flood matters because he helped to shift the balance across American sports. Now owners hold some power, but not all of the power. Players are now able to choose what teams they want to play for and how much money they want to earn. Think of LeBron James in 2010. He was able to choose whatever team he wanted to play for. The grandiosity of this event was a testament to how far the power of the player has come. Without Flood, these professional athletes would not be able to sign the multi-million-dollar contracts that are being signed today. NFL quarterback Jimmy Garoppolo would not be the highest-paid professional football player if Curt Flood did not take a stand. NBA point guard Russell Westbrook would not be able to sign a 5-year, $205 million contract. Or even James Harden, who wouldn't have been able to sign a 4-year, $228 million contract extension if it was not for the first athlete to challenge the reserve clause. All in all, without the conflict Curt Flood endured with the commissioner of the MLB, the greatest compromise in sports history would not have happened as quick as it did. Curt Flood's legacy lives long beyond the MLB, but it touches all professional sports and affects the athletes today.